former UN Deputy Secretary General, even if we would have hoped that you were still there, of course. Welcome. Sharon Burrow, General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC, and Sean Connor, the Deputy Executive Director of International Peace Bureau, and also one of the organizations responsible for this project. I would like to give my first question to all three of you, and maybe John, if you would have a go first. What does common security mean today? We are, as I mentioned, in a situation with bigger security concerns than in a very long time. Can we even talk about common security in these days? What do you say?
Well, first of all, thank you, Anna, for reminding us of what was done 40 years ago by Olof Palme and his commission. I think it's extremely important that you point to what I would say the world should be, rather than to the world as it is. I feel generally that we, in order to deal with international affairs and maybe in society as a whole, that we have to look at both to the world as it is, and then also the world as it should be. And I think our task is simply to reduce the distance between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And right now, you're right, implied in your question, we are in a troubled situation right now, no doubt. And when Olof Palme finished his report in 1982, he was extremely worried about the depth of the Cold War. There were some instances that came out later about nuclear accidents that were very close to bringing us to disaster. And we are in a similar situation today. I happen to have found this morning, it was like God sent. I found it in a bookshelf. Finally, the book I've been looking for 3 weeks. And it is Common Security, and of course for me most important, page 1, as you see, Till Jan from Olof, because I was working with him at the time, and I know how committed he was to this. And I even recall conversations about him saying that it is important that we never lose a sense of direction. Pierre Cherie, who also worked with him, who's here, knows, and also Rolf, that he had this hands-on approach to dealing with today's issues, the world as it is, but he also had a vision that was giving us a direction to go. And now in the midst of this horrible war in Ukraine, with the breakdown of international law and with the breakdown of the European and even global security order, we have to go back to the sources. The sources are there, of course, already in the form UN Charter and all the documents that we have agreed on, principles for international cooperation. But we also have to find a more hands-on approach to coming back to a cooperative atmosphere. And for that, I think the ideas in common security are the ones that we should be guided by. And you will be charged by this being not realistic. Yes, today it might not be realistic, but if we don't go that direction, we are going deeper into a horrible future. So we have to create also hope. And I think this report back from 1982 gave hope at the time. The Cold War ended, it should have ended at least. And now we are in this situation, very serious, very serious. And we have to sort of find the new principles, the new guidelines. And I think you've done a great job by doing that. And it was good to be part of this only advisory role that we played. And I found it very stimulating.
Sharon, from your perspective, also coming from a trade union background, also working for peace and seeing the importance of pushing an agenda for common security, what's your perspective on the relevance of common security in that today? How do we come back to that issue?
I think it's the most important concept that we can actually embrace, because I want to start where Jan left off. Common security cannot be achieved until everyone has the hope of security. It may take us time to build the pillars of that, but if people don't have hope of security, then we have nothing to work with. And so you have then the tensions that lead us to many of the crises we face today. We indeed need to learn the lessons of history. And of course, you would expect me to raise the issues for working people. They were men, unfortunately, Anna, but our forebears who were men came together at the end of World War One, and it was predating the UN, predated all the international multilateral institutions, and it was the creation of the International Labour Organization. And that constitutional sentence that says there can be no lasting conditions for peace without social justice is really what we have to face, whether we're dealing with inequality, with climate, the climate emergency, indeed with the pandemic, or now with the conflicts in the world. And while our heart goes out to the people of Ukraine in this abhorrent war, nevertheless, we also know that there are some 57 or 8 other conflicts in the world that we fail to deal with. And so what does social justice mean as a basis for common security? Well, for us, it means that we deal with those crises with a convergence approach to convergence that has to be based on the hope of a social contract. That's what we built our trade union lives around. That's what we negotiate around. And indeed, I'll come back to some of the elements. But let me say that I think if there's no social contract, there can be no democracy with them. And our democracies depend on that, because too many people haven't seen the hope of democracy. And we need to build a global architecture for peace that takes into account these issues and more.
Sean, your perspective from one of the world's oldest peace organizations, International Peace Bureau.
Sure. So I think both Jan and Sharon have really given us the context of common security in the modern times. We live in a more globalized world than any point before, and we're seeing a trend at the moment where nations or peoples within nations are in some ways combating this globalization that we have because so much injustice has been carried out despite these changes. However, we know we can't go back. We can't undo the globalization that has been done. We can't put ourselves into silos. What's the alternative to, isolating every country is to work with one another to create a better world. This is where common security comes in. The original common security reports was focused mostly on the Cold War situation, but we see the modern world has many differences from what was the conditions of 1982. So we need also common security that really takes on the global approach. This is, as mentioned before, climate change, pandemics, inequality. Globalization needs to be sort of redone in this sense, and I see common security as the approach that we take to this, because the issues that we face in modern times cannot be addressed by any nation alone. And with that simple realization that problems we're facing cannot be simply decided by one government or another, what can we do then? We need to cooperate between governments. So that becomes a very central principle that I see to it. I also see beyond the current crises we're facing at this moment in the near future, we see the risk of World War III, not just in the current situation, but also if we look beyond that, to the rising power of China and the U.S. seeing this as a threat. Some of you may be familiar with the Thucydides trap and this idea of a rising power being challenged by an existing power. This is something that we at the IPB see as really an important issue to tackle now before tensions get to the point where we reach really a new sort of global insecurity between the US and China and allies that come along throughout that process. So common security can also serve as a preventative measure for what we see in the future being larger or more globalized conflicts.
You all three of you have been part of this advisory commission that has been mentioned now a few times, and thank you all for the work that you have done for this, for giving us the inputs to this report. If I may ask also from you, all three of you, looking at now the recommendations that we've compiled based on the input and expertise from you and the rest of the group, is there anyone in particular that you would like to highlight? Yeah, would you like to start?
Well, I think you made reference to it in the beginning. There was a formula that was established in the UN 2005 at the summit meeting, which I think summarizes the agenda for not the UN alone, but for world community. It says simply that there will be no peace without development, and there will be no development without peace, and there will be neither peace nor development without respect for human rights. And that says it all. 3 pillars, peace, development, and human rights, I would say also democracy, and they are mutually reinforcing. And if one of these pillars is weak, the whole structure is weak. So we have to work simultaneously on these 3 aspects, apropos your comment on the social cohesion. We need to really define security in the broader context, as you also indicated, Sean. We, Sweden, and Stefan, you did a great job, Sweden and the Security Council, bringing the climate issue to the level of the security analysis. We may have to do that on other issues in the future, pandemics, migration, refugees, and so forth, to see the totality of security. So I would say, for me, the most important recommendation, of course, with my background, is to strengthen international cooperation and also the belief in international cooperation. I must say, looking back at my more than 50 years in working with international issues, that I never thought I would have to defend international cooperation, multilateralism. And even worse, I never thought I would have to defend democracy. But we are in a state of history where you really have to take this seriously. We saw during the Trump years a challenge. We see it in the political map in Europe. We see it in so many nations where the inward-looking forces sort of look at the outside world as a problem, not as a potential and as a partner. And that goes counter to the whole philosophy of the common security. So for us to take seriously now, going back to common solutions, international solutions, and come to the conclusion, which to me is basic. The most important conclusion for me is that a good international solution is in the national interest of the states. If we can by that marry international efforts with national and take away this false line between outside and inside. If you look at issues like climate, migration, pandemics, you can't draw that line. So we have to bring them together and show the dynamics of working with them both in the domestic context and in the international. So that I would give number 1. Without devaluing, of course, the other.
Of course, this, no, I asked you to highlight one, so it was a hard task. Thank you. Sharon, from your perspective.
So I want to highlight the fact that the 3 pillars that Jan talks about, all of them are fractured right now, if not broken. And so if we're going to actually think about what we need to fix those pillars, because they remain as enduring today as they indeed were at the time of articulation, then we need to say, what's the international measure we could take? And for us, we spend a lot of time responding to conflict. You see the Security Council meetings, the UN meetings, lots of peace commissions, peace envoys. We do not spend the time to actually say, how do we build the conditions for peace? So building a global architecture for peace is something that we are very committed to. Every year I go to the climate conferences for good reason. Sometimes depressing, sometimes optimistic, but we know the world has to act together on climate, or otherwise everybody suffers. It's our only home. Well, the same thing for peace. Why can't we come together, perhaps not every year, but every 3 years, for example, with a conference of the parties, including trade unions and civil society, because we know how to negotiate, and actually look at what are the measures that we could put in place to actually shore up those three pillars and drive the conditions for sustainable peace. And for me, I look to Sweden because Stefan knows this, so does Jan, but for a long time, I've admired the history of Sweden. Not every bit of it, Stefan, can I say. But, you know, but in the 1890s, you know your history. You were a poor country, but you made a social contract. You said you were going to share your wealth. You were going to build social protection for everybody and grow wealthy accordingly. I've heard you all give the speeches. So we need a new social contract, and that's what we take to the Conference of the Parties, amongst other things. What's the condition for just development, for human rights? It's jobs, climate-friendly jobs with just transition measures. It's rights and the accountability for nations and corporations for human rights. It's universal social protection for everybody. We have the wealth, let's share it for that peace and democracy dividend. It's about equality. Of course, that's about income, but it's about gender and it's about race. And it's about inclusion, which allows us to get to the SDGs, the Paris Climate Agreement, to put the architecture for peace back in place. So I'm in for the global architecture of peace as much as we also support other recommendations.
Thank you very much. And to intrigue your reading, there are a few very interesting proposals on how to create this peace architecture that we're talking about. Sean, from your perspective.
Yes. So coming from the IPB, of course, we have focused much of our work on disarmament, and I think sections 3 and 4 of the recommendations really drive home many of these points, such as the treaty on prohibition of nuclear weapons being one very important one. But what I want to highlight most in relation specifically to disarmament treaties and international work, which can reduce tensions, is the role of civil society and the role of education. These treaties and a lot of this international work that's being done can be quite complex and confusing for the average citizen. When Trump comes to power and he starts exiting these international treaties, and there is a lot of support behind him in the US for doing so because people do not understand what's going on, and there is no intermediary, there's no involvement of regular people, individuals, and organizations in communicating these messages, in understanding what exactly is happening here, and how these treaties can create trust and protection. So I think it comes in the call to action that's directly before the recommendations in the text, where there's a really nice section written about the role of civil society, on one hand in education, and on the other hand in pressuring governments who may be less inclined to be involved in arms control treaties to take the initiative and to reduce tensions through those. So I think for me, coming from the international peace movement, really the need of a strong civil society to be an intermediary between these governments and the individuals who are less involved maybe in international affairs is absolutely essential for bringing together these recommendations and making them a reality and something that can have strong popular support behind them.
I saw that you were picking up something from your pocket, Jan, so I suspect that you have now a thing that you would like to contribute with. But let me also send another thought or a question along to you, because I think that it might be intertwined with this popular support and what Sean was also talking about. Because one very important element for common security to work is trust. And I also mentioned it in my introduction, the need to build trust between, of course, people, but also nations. And the UN Secretary General often talks about the world suffering from a trust deficit disorder. So my question to you then would be, which is a hard question, but still, how do we build trust?
Well, we certainly have to take it as one of our major challenges, because I have rarely lived through a more serious lack of trust period than we have today. You see the problems in the UN Security Council. And you see that even in a conflict like Yemen, which would naturally not have big power implications, still goes on. In Syria, you had the problem between US and Russia, of course, but there are so many areas where this mistrust is stopping action in security, but also in development and in human rights. So I would say we have to try to get back to these principles and values. And I did pick up from my back pocket my 13th version of the Charter of the UN. I was deputy secretary, I had it with me all the time, and they challenged me when there was a black tie dinner, and I wouldn't have it, but I had it in my pocket anyway. But I think these principles and guidelines that are set down here, from everything from peaceful settlements of the disputes in Article 33 to the finding peaceful settlements and so forth, but also articles like the Secretary General's right, according to Article 99, to take initiatives of his own and so forth. We have to really use this, but the most relevant issue now for the Ukraine war is to come back to the principles that were established in Europe in 1975. 1975, there was the Helsinki Final Act, one of the most important negotiations. Both Pierre and Rolf worked with this, and we worked together on it. And it was like a workshop for 5-10 years afterwards on building trust. In the security area, with military information about exercises and so forth, economic exchange, promoting economic exchange and trade, and human contacts, people-to-people contacts, human rights, in fact. I would say the end of the Cold War, the beginning of the end of the Cold War started with that, with those principles. Unfortunately, now in the Ukraine war, Russia is making no reference whatsoever to these principles: peaceful settlement disputes, non-interference, sovereignty, territorial integrity, but rather to nationalism and rather emotional aspects that Sarah and I talked about before this meeting. And I think we have to, I would say that perhaps the time is not right for Helsinki 2, but there is certainly time to remind us of the principles that some of our predecessors as politicians and diplomats have labored with and worked through. I negotiated the, I'm glad to bring them, the 17 goals. My God, it was 4.5 years of work. I can't enumerate the number of hours we worked on that. So here are documents, the final act, and of course the Red Charter, that are there, and an enormous resource. And we need to have a sort of a revival of knowledge, back to the point on education, on what already exists, and try to get the major powers in to follow these principles. That I think is a trust-building exercise of some magnitude right now, but we have to adopt it.
There are recommendations also concerning Helsinki 2 and also education for peace. So just to intrigue you all to read the report thoroughly. Sharon, the building of trust, of course, also social justice and the social contract that you also mentioned before is, of course, a very important part of this. What's your reflection on the trust part and the need to build trust?
Well, it is at the core of everything, because we've been warning now for almost a decade that trust in democracy was declining, particularly amongst young people. When we saw not just the 8/9 crisis, but in fact the subsequent areas of global shock, we've been warning that in fact people were feeling despair because they couldn't make ends meet in too many parts of the world. The internal displacement of people, let alone the external waves of refugees and the hard-hearted approach to refugees as if they didn't belong to our own human race in too many parts of the world, including, I'm sad to say, my own country, which is a migrant country, Australia. And we said you have to be really conscious that this lack of trust, and it was driven in large part by the quest for corporate profit at every turn, without thinking of the people, without thinking of distribution, abusing human rights in our supply chains, which are the basis of our global trade and therefore the accumulated wealth. But when you put all that together, people were then becoming so despairing that they became angry. And people would say, but they're not on the street, Sharon. I'm saying, well, come with me and have a conversation. Sit on the doorstep of a family in the Philippines or in an African country or somewhere else, and you will cry with these families about their lack of capacity to pay their rent, to buy essential products, to send their children to school with proper clothes and footwear. And we saw it. But indeed, unless the world sees it and understands that you can't build trust unless you're serious. You can't give a handout and say, trust me. You have to listen to people and build the solutions with them. And going back to the strength of the ILO and the need to reconstruct our multilateralism, it was a tripartite body from the beginning. Now, with civil society and the UN, we may need to be more than just tripartite. But it said, without workers and employers, we won't negotiate a settlement, but be a trust in that settlement. That still stands today. People have to trust that the solutions are just, whether it's for climate, for inequality, or indeed for the conditions for peace and sustainability.
I also, in my introduction, said that our ambition with this report is also to evoke engagement and to sort of spark a debate or discussion on peace and common security, and that our ambition is to, of course, address civil society, also policymakers and others, and that it is the task for all of us to carry this now forward. So my final question to all three of you, and I start with you, Sean, to whom, in your perspective, do we need to address this message, and who should carry this forward?
In the broadest sense, I think the most clear answer is everyone. I see a sort of hegemonic definition of what security is in the modern world, which is more weapons equals more security. This is, what at least many of us, myself included, have been taught from a young age. We protect ourselves by having strong military, strong weapons, and that somehow makes us safe. Now, we know, as this report is saying, this is not the case, but this remains something present maybe in the subconscious minds of so many people, and when you try to engage them on this, they can fall back on that because this is a lesson they've had from a young age. But when we speak of specific target audiences we are looking for, one of them that I identified was educators, academics, and students. Governments, of course, have to also be receptive to the message, so that can take some time to reach them. Militaries and the military-industrial complex need to also hear this message. We need to be able to have dialogue with those who are involved in the military, especially when it comes to matters such as just conversion and moving from large militaries to employing these people in other fields. And the United Nations, of course, is another audience. So those are just a few that came to mind quickly for me.
Sharon.
So I think we need to reach our own constituencies because everybody must be in this together. And so this for us is an easy ask with Labor. We're leading towards a Congress this year. We will make this report and the broader as part and parcel of the foundations for a broader social contract. I think though we have to reach out to people who can influence our democracies and get them on board with a framing around trust and development that is inclusive of people. I think we have to talk to Stefan Löfven, who's actually now co-chairing a very important UN task force for indeed the Secretary General on effective multilateralism. And hopefully, we can pick up some of these ideas. But I also think that in the end, we have to fight for democratic solutions that include these recommendations like we've never fought before. And that means we have to reach out through education, indeed, through discussions with our people. We have to co-opt the young leaders of today, but also the political legends who still are running our countries or have influence. And we have to come together. I want to leave you just with a very quick story. I'm sitting here thinking about the fact I was a very young teacher in the 70s, and I say very young in those days, but in the 70s, and it was the UN International Year of Young People, and peace was one of the items on the agenda. I was threatened with disciplinary action for building a student union council around education for peace. Of course, I was, part of a union. That didn't happen, but we still have to thwart those who would not allow us to talk about the realities of the conditions that our people, young, older people, workers, everybody face today.
Thank you. There are very big groups of stakeholders already laid out there. Jan, from your perspective, what would you like to ask?
Well, I guess we need some type of mobilization of good forces. And we have to go very broadly. We have to leave this silo approach that unfortunately is plaguing bureaucracies. I think they can be found in UN and in Sweden also, I must say self-critically. We work very much in the silo, in the vertical approach. And that's where we find our colleagues, that's where we speak our language. But the problems are not vertical. The problems are horizontal. And that means that we have to mobilize not only governments and international organizations, but also labor unions, the private sector, the business world, the academic world, the civil society, media, the economic world, I said that, I guess. I mean, you got to sort of take this horizontal approach, and if I may say so, put the problem in the center, and the glass of water is a very good, not a very appropriate problem to look at. The glass of water, and look at the problem, put the problem in the center, and then ask who can do something about it. And it will turn out that you need all these other actors that I just mentioned, that Sharon and Sean mentioned. They need to be around the problem. And afterwards, we should aim for an informal or formal division of labor. If we sort of take that approach and not sit and jealously watch our own silo and not share information and so forth, we will be not approaching anywhere on the solution side. So we can go that way, and that would also unite us with the common security. The whole common security concept is that. And I would say almost sentimentally that to me the most important word in the world today is together. That's the most important word. If we can realize that we cannot alone solve these issues, we need to do it together, then we have that as sort of a driving force, almost of an emotional nature, but also very down-to-earth utilitarian approach. And also it comes back to this document again. You know, of course, which are the first three words of the Charter. The first three words of the UN Charter is "we the peoples." I must say, as a government representative, it doesn't say "we the governments." It's "we the people." And we should be remembering that all the time. And that's what this report's all about.
Thank you so much to all three of you. I think that to leave with the word of togetherness also for our shared world, which is the beginning of our report. And also to underline that I think that this is one of the things that has been so very unique and very inspiring with the work that we've done, that the group of advisors in this commission has had so very variety of backgrounds that we really, I think, managed to overcome silence in the sense that you're talking about, to have a more joint perspective on the challenges that we face. So thank you to all three of you, and now we will listen to a video message from one of our other commissioners from South Africa.
Dear friends, the recommendation of the Common Security Report 2022 is what humanity critically needs to address the urgent convergence of crises. The recommendations only stand a chance, however, of being achieved if we address the issue of security in an intensely intersectional manner. We will not achieve the recommendations if we do not address the deep inequality that exists in the world, in which we see overconsumption by some and underconsumption by the many. President Eisenhower's departure speech, in which he warned about the powerful commercial and military interests driving policy making, is more relevant than ever before. We must seek to rein in the industrial military complex as he advised. These recommendations are neither fundamentally new nor revolutionary, but they are what is critically needed at this moment. And what must be different about this moment is that we try harder to generate maximum political will and a more inclusive approach that includes the Global South and a range of constituencies, from women to indigenous peoples, that sit on the margins of a conversation that they should be at the center of. Thank you very much.
Is also one of the contribution to our launch. Welcome, Alexander.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. Can you just reconfirm that?
We hear you very well. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure for me to be able to contribute to this important work. We are indeed at a crossroads, also as regards the threat of nuclear weapons is concerned. The conclusions of the 1982 report that international security must rest on a commitment to joint survival rather than the threat of mutual destruction is as pertinent today as it was then. And common security is the alternative to nuclear competition. And sorry, I see my camera is not on. I see a message, my camera is not on, but my camera is on. I cannot do anything. I will just continue. The existential threat of nuclear weapons and of the risks of nuclear rhetoric escalating have again been brought into sharp focus in recent weeks. These risks are today graver than they have been at any time since the height of the Cold War. And the consequences of nuclear weapons use would affect us all. Nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence create great risks for humanity and for our common security. And all this, of course, underlines the urgency of progress on nuclear disarmament as the only way to prevent the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that any use of these weapons would entail. So we must avoid a slide back into an unmitigated nuclear arms race dynamic. And I would like to highlight that the recognition that the nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought demands conceptually the abolition of nuclear weapons. So consequently, there needs to be a serious engagement by all states in a process to discuss how to move away from the nuclear deterrence paradigm and to develop alternative and common security approaches and policies. So this aspect, moving away from the precarious concept of the nuclear deterrence logic, seems to me one of the absolute key points. And of course, for this, we need a much broader discussion and a broad stakeholder process. Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the obvious lack of camera. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander. We now welcome a new set of guests up on the stage. Mr. Stefan Löfven, former Prime Minister of Sweden, Åsa Linderborg, who used to be, when you entered our commission, the OSCE's Special Representative on Youth and Security, and Trisha Shetty, the CEO for SheSays and the President of the Steering Committee, and also representing Paris Peace Forum. Most welcome to all three of you. Both Rosalind and Trisha has also served on our advisory commission, so I'm very happy to have you both here, of course, and honored that you had the time to also be with us today, Stefan. I will start with a question to all three of you. So looking a bit further into the future, because we have now heard that now we of course face very serious security challenges that needs to be handled and tackled, but we must remain with the vision of common security. So your reflections on this, how can the concept of common security be useful, and is there any recommendation also from the report that you would like to highlight? I'll start with you, Stefan.
First, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity, and thank you for the work that you've done on common security. I remember well when this report was launched in 1982. And I also remember that when I was elected party leader 10 years ago, on the international arena, I started to talk about common security because that's a concept, a strategy that advances. So it will live, and it's the strongest. I'm so glad that you more than put it on the agenda, you made this to the agenda. This is the main agenda. How do we do this? Now, I've just started the work for the UN, the Secretary General, how to do a great panel on the how. Because as Jan and others said, we have the UN Charter, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, we have the Paris Agreement. So we know the what, we know what we need to do, but we stumble on the how. And therefore we will work with this. So I can't, I don't have the answers yet. We'll meet next week for the first time physically in New York to discuss that. But it's obvious that two things I want to emphasize. First is the human-centered perspective. I think that is crucial to find this trust that world citizens, no matter where they live, that really feel and experience that this multilateral cooperation is for me. And I think the other perspective is that we need to change narrative from one that seems to too often anyway, mean that when others gain and prosper, base of prosperity, we lose. It is not a zero-sum game. This is a win-win-win game. And the health pandemic showed us that very clearly. We said that we need to make sure that everybody gets vaccinated. The vaccine was developed faster than anyone could ever believe, but then countries were holding on to substances and other. And I remember clearly talking to the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, when I found out what was happening around, and I said, shouldn't we at this time sit around the table and say we need this amount of vaccines, we want to handle the logistics in this way. We probably need to educate people in different regions of the world to make sure that everybody gets this shot. That is what we should have done, instead of inventing, developing a vaccine, and then start to fight about it. So that is an area I can see very clearly that we must be able to show this win-win. And now, obviously, when countries have been closed for a year or so, the moment they open up, they have the disease. So I think there's a chance to show that we can do something quite quickly to also build trust. Climate issue is another one, just to agree there, but that's also an issue where you see when you change the narrative. When I discovered that the Swedish business sector was starting to change the way of thinking from a position where they rejected, said this is expensive, it's difficult, it will ruin our companies, to a narrative where they said, let's bring this into our business model because we will profit from the change. So, and that means that you go from a picture that the change, the transition is something difficult and tough, and very difficult, yes, but you know that on the other end is a better society, is a better life. So I think changing narrative is right. And young people. I visited a school yesterday in North Stockholm, a high school, and it was, it was so filled with energy. So I think that people-centered, young people, bring people together, start building the pressure, because common security in 1982, that was one of the most important messages to me anyway. You need to build the pressure from people talking.
Rosalie, from your perspective, being also part of the advisory commission, what are the recommendations that you would like to highlight, and how do you see it, the importance of coming back to the common security perspective?
Firstly, thank you so much for all the work you put into emphasizing, and it's a renaissance for the term, also the politics of common security. For me, common security is a method and promise of coexistence and solidarity. And a few years ago, I made a promise to myself to do my very best to leave the world better than the one that I was born into. And what I can see is that we're going the other way. You asked the question in the beginning if it's useful. It's not a matter of useful, it's a matter of necessity. It's absolutely crucial. But honestly, we don't really have a choice in common security. The other one is destruction. And I believe the ones saying that it is naive to talk about peace or naive to talk about common security, they haven't suffered from the consequences of the opposite. And therefore romanticize and glorify it. We have to be the ones with strong voices, emphasizing the other, that's peace, with the people, everything else that involves in this report. But as I said, we're seeing that it's going the other way. Democracy is the most important thing that we have. And according to the DDM Institute from the University of Gothenburg, they say that only 32 liberal democracies are left, which is 14% of the world population. Only 14% have the privilege of living in liberal democracies. And that's nothing. Also, shrinking civic space, it's people's movement in civil society that creates democracy. We can see invasions and war. Everywhere we can see fear and the lack of trust, which we have heard the former panel speaking about. The climate crisis, we can see injustice everywhere. And right now we can also, so an example for that is how we talk about refugees. We call some real refugees and some not. Justice is not to choose between which injustice you have to face. It's to consistently face all of them and tackle all of them. That's justice. We can choose between them. Inequality, of course. The pandemic has increased that within countries and between countries. I know you asked a specific question. I'm leading up to the answer, I promise. There's just so much to say about this. And once again, it's a necessity. And as you said, it's to create a global discourse on peace, because we lack that right now. And we're also in the institutions that are supposed to bring that to the table. And for me, trust is the base of all prosperity. We can see that we bring everywhere. We can see that also in Sweden, in the local, how we treat each other, but also in the multilateral system. And the problem here is we don't have anyone, especially during these times, that have the courage to be the first one to trust. Because I believe distrust creates more distrust. But if we have someone that can be the first one to trust, I believe people will follow. You can be the ones, maybe. Looking at you. Okay. Well, of course, young people. But we have to also give them power to do that. The status quo, as it is now, is the most detrimental part. But two recommendations. For me, it's, of course, all of them is important to abolish nuclear weapons, to combat climate crisis, but I want to emphasize the first part, which is both 1.1 but also 1.8. And I'll start with the last one, 1.8, which is to reform the UN system. That is nothing new. It's been going on for many years, and especially in civil society, talking about how can we create a better UN, individual rights and so on, and shift the power from Security Council to another one to General Assembly. That's more progressive. And that is truly one of the hardest questions, because the hard thing is the big five that holds the conditions of power. How can we encourage them to give power? And that's, in general, the hardest thing that human beings can do, give power to others. And I don't have the solution here as well. But I think we have to be great to talk about it and be many. And remember, it's not the government that forms the people. The common agenda, but also common security can be a method to can I say, create and give more sense of responsibility for the people, so they can hold UN or states accountable for that. But also one when it comes to military alliances. The strongest military alliance is democracy. Democracies never fight democracies. We have to remember that. How can we create democracies? And I believe we're not offensive here. We are defensive, because what we can see happening to the space is shrinking. But we have to be, if I say aggressive, I hope you know in the hybrid, peacefully aggressive to create democracies, uphold them, encourage people, strengthen civil society, people's movement to do that. We have a lot here to do. And there's so much more to say about all time here.
Thank you very much. You will have more opportunities, but turning now to you, Tricia, finally, also from your perspective on the recommendations and on the importance of common security.
Thank you. It's truly has been a great pleasure to have worked with everyone in the commission and have the meetings that we had. The one question that I had asked us all to consider is, right now, even amongst this group, we are living in safe, secure conditions right now. I hope you are not worried about this place currently being bombed. I hope you have a sense of understanding that this is a secure place. So when we speak about security, we must acknowledge that where there are people currently living in terms that's not this, right? So how does this report affect their day-to-day livelihood, their day-to-day life? That was important for me. And when I think of who are the people that are being deprived of their human rights, and we say we the people, right? Under that umbrella, who are the people that do not have a sense of security? I think obviously of Ukrainians. I think of Palestinians who are not afforded their right to pray, right to dignity. I think of refugees that are broadly categorized as uncivilized, right? I think of all those people who are deprived of their human rights. And in terms of what can we do, I also take a lot of solace in 1.8. And I would read it. The recommendation is reform the UN to give more power and authority to the General Assembly, particularly on security matters, to avoid individual members paralyzing the UN security system. Jan, Stefan, you have worked intimately with the UN. Could you honestly tell me that you have gone to places of deep conflict zones and told them, don't worry, the UN Security Council is meeting right now, right? And things will change. All these member states are going to gather and things will change. I said, no. And to me, that is a great sobering reality, right? We are talking about a system that's constantly failing people. I work on the ground, and I can tell you, I have never gone to ground and told people, do you know member states adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? You can now live with the security that you don't have to go out and worry about being raped, or stay at home and worry about domestic violence. These words, these treaties have to have impact on people's lives, right? So how do we get to that place? And I know that in the following questions we will, but for me it's important to set a context of where we are. Because I will tell you, every time I'm in places, people want to talk about gender equality, but the second I start talking about the inequality, that makes them uncomfortable. They don't want to talk about that. They want sanitized conversations about peace and security, but that does not exist. Our job is to not make you feel good, The job is to show you the horrible realities and push for better. And when we say push for better, it's systematic. There's money behind all of this, right? There is common will for destruction, for insecurity. There is financial incentive. I'm so glad a lot of you spoke about the military-industrial complex. War is a very profitable business for many people. So we are pushing back against all of these systems. And truly, I love the word home. And I'm so glad Jan and Sharon brought it up. But it was forever bastardized for me after I heard my sister Nadia Murad for the first time say, hope is dangerous. Hope has an expiration date. Hope requires action. And we are at that place right now where we must call upon ourselves to take action and also fundamentally realize, and I know we'll come to this later, that our leadership has failed us drastically. So I will leave it at that.
Maybe then because it's a perfect passage, because I have that question also to all of you, because one difficulty in creating a safer world and in sort of bridging the gap between the commitments we make or governments make, maybe at the UN and so on, and delivering all these promises for the people is, of course, lack of democracy, an increasing amount of authoritarian leaders and countries, and Rosalina mentioned the number of people living in the world democracy at this stage. So it's very well connected to the fact that delivering for people and also the possibility for people to claim both legitimacy but also results, for the leaders to deliver results. So how do we reverse this trend? You also come from a country, we've all been taught at school that India is the largest democracy in the world. Right now, not anymore. That is the case. How can we reverse this authoritarian trend and strengthen democracy?
Thank you for actually saying out loud. India, world's largest democracy, now not so much the case. There is a deficit in courage in people to not even find the words to say India is a democracy in great crisis right now. They don't say it. And when you question them, they say, oh, we need to, have the alliance with India to have some sort of pushback against China. Oh, we need to work with India to push the climate agenda forward, right? But people will keep talking about how Trump was a great menace to democracy. Maria Ressa, this year's Nobel Peace Laureate, kept raising the warning signs of what was happening with Facebook and disinformation and how it was affecting democracy for the longest time because it was happening in the Philippines. It took for the problem to come to the global north for people to catch up with what's happening. Right now, at this very point, there are homes being bulldozed, there are shops being bulldozed in our nation's capital. And just today, I see a video clip of Boris Johnson behind a bulldozer putting a garland of flowers. The optics of it is terrible. I'm not saying Boris Johnson is condoning this at all, but the optics is absolutely terrible. When Donald Trump was visiting India, there was active genocide and war crimes being committed in my country against minorities. There were riots that were going on. And you have Gregory Stanton, the founder of Genocide Watch, that said what is happening in India is alarming. We are living through calls of genocide. And he said, look, I accurately predicted the Rwandan genocide, and I'm telling you, it is going to happen in India. It is already happening. But you don't see people talking about it. And I will tell you, as a people, when you hear silence from a global society, it sort of makes you feel like your existence, your oppression, your human rights do not matter. And you should never look at a people and make them feel like what is happening to them doesn't matter. We have members of parliament who've been accused of committing terrorist acts, who came out on bail, one member of parliament, by saying she had cancer. She then said she drank cow urine, and that's how her cancer got cured. And she's now occupying the member of parliament office. This is the first time we've had a terror accused occupying an office. So this is where we are as a people. And yet, in parallel, what I see is my prime minister get awards on international stages to sanitize his image because you want access to my people. Because it is the world's largest democracy, it is the world's largest youth population. So by extension, you get access to the world's largest user base of cell phones and data. That is what we have been reduced to. That is what you reduce democracy down to. And please know, this is going to come to your doorstep too. So if you do not take action, all we're asking you to do is recognize it and have the courage to say it out loud. That's all that we're asking you to do. The people are fighting on the front lines. The activists and lawyers are putting their bodies on the line and fighting this on the front lines. They're putting their sanity on the line. All we're asking you to do is take attention and at least find the words and the courage to say it out loud. This is wrong. This is genocide. And there is no amount of diplomacy that can justify you sitting across the table from a noted war criminal and not even having the gumption to say, what are you doing to your people? We, the people, should count for something.
Stefan, turning to you also with the experience, of course, from both being in national government but also from the multilateral system, how to bridge this gap. There is an expectance from people, of course, to deliver on the promises made, and far too many promises are not delivered upon. Andreas also talked a little bit about this on the Agenda 2030 and so on, which of course creates or infuses the lack of trust in politicians and in the democratic system. So how can we restore also the trust in democracy, and also what Tricia is mentioning, how it's been eroded in many countries, the trust for democracy?
Well, it's very complex because the problem with decrease in democracy is many perspectives. The one I think is very important. Democracy has to deliver. Has to deliver the social contract. So that people can see, well, this is the way to go. Why is Putin so aggressive towards Ukraine? Well, it's geographical, he talks about the security. One thing that he does not talk so much about is that if he can see Ukraine who has succeeded in managed to develop democracy, develop a society that will be a role model for also Russian people. That is what he is afraid of. He's afraid of democracy because it delivers. And the democracy is the only form of rule where everybody counts for the same, we have the same value. So that's what he's afraid of. But democracy needs to deliver. The American history, US, you can see I visited the US first time 1992, I believe it was. And I read a book that a newspaper by the name of Philadelphia Inquirer had put together a number of articles about the development in the United States over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And it was horrifying to read because you have some going like that, and you have a lot of middle class, ordinary workers like that. So I remember, and this is 30 years ago, and I remember thinking, what happens to a society where you have these gaps widening all the time and you cannot see the change of that? That would be disastrous. And I think that's why we are where we are now, when it comes to the United States. So Sharon is also, you're absolutely right, and we'll take up on that also in this need. So we need a social contract so that people in their daily lives can see this, something is happening in a positive direction. And then, of course, you have dictators that will not listen to that, but once again, good examples, gather the good forces. You can see that democracy is by far best ruling system. I know that Winston Churchill has been quoted, they say that he was not so fond of democracy, he said this is the best, no, compared to all the other systems, this is the best. But he was a Democrat, and he was right that this is the best, but it has to deliver. If we don't deliver in democracy, people will mistrust democracy. that's easy to say, but you need to be aware of that.
I remember when we launched this project almost a year ago, and the first conversations that we had in the advisory commission on security, we tended to talk about very many other dimensions of security rather than the fear, the lack of, or the what do you say, the non-existence of military threats. So it was more on the risks, of course, to security caused by climate change, also growing inequality, democratic backslide, etc. So many other perspectives than the sort of the hard military perspective on security. Of course, during the course of our meetings, also with tensions growing in many parts of the world, and not least now in Sweden's neighborhood in Russia, for example, leading up to the invasion of, or the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we should say, because of course it started already 8 years ago. Our conversation sort of took a bit of another turn, and I also remember specifically from the launch that I was asking the question on the threat of nuclear weapons, because it was a forgotten threat. People did not talk about it only a few months ago, but now again it's in our consciousness, of course, for everyone. So my question then to you, do you also feel that we now face the risk of not taking the risk or the threat of the security threat of climate change seriously enough, because we divert all the attention to more of the hard security, so to say? What Tricia, may I ask? Or Rosalind, please start. Sure.
Thank you. I think, as Jan mentioned, we work in silos, but we also do that in our minds in a way. When something happens, we direct all the attention to one place. When something else happens, we move our attention there. But often it's when it's already too late, where it's burning. And I think that way is detrimental for prosperity. And one thing that the pandemic taught me is that everything is possible if we have the will. And everything that's not happening or happening is due to will. We turned the whole world upside down in 2 weeks. We shut down, we transitioned into this digital world. Everything happened because it suddenly leaders had the will to do that. And that taught me something. To never accept no. Because it's possible if we have the idea. And we have the ideas and solutions and suggestions, and we have science backing us up. But the political leaders with the strongest power to change that, they don't have it. And I will lead back to what you said, Stefan, about young people. Something I can see is that young people, they have the will. So something I want to do, I hope to have the help from this room, is to encourage young people to stand up and be part of public offices. So they can one day, and as soon as possible, have the power to shift it. And as I said before, I want to leave the world a better place than the one I got. So in Sweden, we say, we don't want to do that from now on. We are the world from our children. We're not doing a good job in that. And this is a crisis that we're not managing because we're looking always towards when it's burning. In this crisis, when it burns, it's too late.
Tricia, from your perspective, do we manage to keep the several security crises in our minds at the same time?
Of course, I think the people do, the political leadership does not. And speaking of political will, I forget who was the first wise person who said this, but I think the line that gets to be repeated many times. Political will is a renewable resource, right? So unlike the horrible climate crisis that we're facing, Thomas Gauss had once told me this. He said, we forget the SDGs is also a social contract, and what it keeps reinforcing is the roles and duties of right holders and duty bearers, right? So once we clearly establish who are the right holders, who are the duty bearers, and what the social contract is between these two parties, I really think we can move forward. Speaking about the climate crisis, the two most cost-effective solutions to fight back against the climate crisis is investing in young girls' education and sexual and reproductive health care rights. To this, I will go back to right now what we're seeing happening in Afghanistan and bring it down to, because if you talk about this without parentheses, brackets, I think the situation becomes in a way where someone listening does not know where to start. So if you're looking for a place, an avenue to start, just ensure women, gender non-conforming people have guaranteed access to education and sexual and reproductive health care rights, and make sure you are lobbying with your state representatives to ensure that those who do not have access to this do, which means also ensuring they have access to safe menstrual hygiene, that the route to get to school is safe, and ensuring that the barriers to education is taken out.
Political will is lacking really. You have a vast experience from the political field, Stefan. And I know for sure that your political will has not been lacking, but what is your reflection on this? How can we strengthen the will to actually make change?
First, I want to say we have to work with both these issues and the health issues and the health issues. We cannot just separate them. We have to. So there's no choice. And I mean, the peace, first start with the climate. We know what we need to do. So we know that the knowledge is there, so we need to make sure that we do it quick enough. Now we've been given a year 2030, if we don't act soon enough, 2030 to do it. At the same time, nuclear weapons can make it too late tomorrow. So we need to keep focus on both, and we also need to keep focus on health issues. So there's no choice but to work. And Jan mentioned we need to get out of the silos and see the horizontal perspective instead. And I think that will. I think it's wrong to say that all political leaders lack the will or the energy, or I think that's not real, because we also need to acknowledge that there's a dynamic within politics as well. So that's the way we need to go. So once again, gather the good forces. We know what we need to do, and let's find a more efficient methods of doing what we need to do. And also make once again the narrative, the incentives of doing things. We know now that we can produce steel without using coal. We can produce steel that is fossil-free. Nobody believed that 10 years ago. Now we know that, and we know that we can have a clean energy sector. We know that the cars can be clean. We know this, and I think we are at the tipping point now where we'll find more and more people, leaders as well, that say, well, this is the way we actually want to go. Because that's the best incentive. We want to do something. And now you see this, here's the new technology, where you have new technology, you have new jobs, the future jobs, and where you have the future jobs, you have the future welfare. So I don't know if it was an answer, but
it was a good reflection, and also a reminder that we know what we have to do. It's just also, getting the job done in one way. And of course, now we also have a good report with a series of new recommendations on the work that needs to be done, and the work that needs to be done is to be done by all of us. So also, as Rosalind encouraged us all to be these courageous people to also lead the way, that is a task for all of us ahead. So with this, I would like to thank you all so much for your being in the commission, Rosalind and Trisha, and for Stefan to also now taking the torch forward in the work that you are doing, of course, both in secret, becoming appointments, and within the UN. We will now round up by having a few words from Philip Jennings, who is the co-president of the International Peace Bureau, and this project actually came about already in 2020 in a conversation between Philip Jennings and myself. We came up with the idea and realized that in 2022 it will be the 40th anniversary, so to say, of the Common Security, the original Common Security Report. And we said we need to do something about this to remind the world of the concept of common security and the need to use this concept for our shared future. So please, Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for those kind words, Anna. It is, of course, Stefan's fault because he was the chair of a global commission on the future of work. And I found the experience so inspiring and practical and useful. I thought we would bring the same spirit to mark the report that we are celebrating today. I want to express my thanks to all of you that have been with us today. I want to thank the Olof Palme Institute, the ITUC, the International Peace Bureau, who have been the three motors, the three good forces behind this initiative. The message to us is to continue our common endeavors for peace, to implement this report and its call to action. And we must not be found wanting. I'd like to thank the Global Advisory Commission members for their insight and application. You have told us not to hang our heads in the struggle for peace. Please continue your own efforts to reimagine peace. We ask the whole of civil society to mobilize for peace, to help us reimagine our world. The motive for this project was more than to mark the 40th anniversary of the original. Rather, could the idea of common security still have relevance and resonance in a time of confrontation, war, and failing multilateralism? And our answer is yes. There are parallels with those urgent and crisis times. In 1980, the doomsday clock stood at 7 minutes to midnight. In 2020, when we began our effort, it was 100 seconds to midnight, where it stands today. With the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, it has ticked closer to midnight. And we support the calls for an immediate ceasefire and a new peace process. In 1982, the report stated that in its 2 years of its work, the international situation had become more dangerous, with an accelerating arms race, the development of new nuclear weapons, with worries that the superpowers were considering fighting a nuclear war. Our report repeats those warnings. We underline the existential threats of nuclear weapons, of climate change, pandemics, and all compounded by a toxic mix of inequality, extremism, nationalism, gender violence, and a shrinking democratic space. We have identified all the dangers and risks lying in wait for humanity. How we respond to them, to climate change and nuclear weapons, will decide our survival. We echo the original Palme report fears of an international order facing severe challenges, that we are teetering toward the abyss, and our common systems and structures needed to provide security, combat poverty and inequality are inadequate and frequently ignored or violated. As the UN Secretary General stated, humanity faces a stark and urgent choice: breakdown or breakthrough. We hope this report serves as yet another wake-up call to the world. We continue to see the value of the driving principle of common security, that international security must rest on a commitment to common survival rather than the threat of mutual destruction, of inclusive peace processes, a new social contract, respect for human rights, and the long-term goal of general and complete disarmament. We aim to work to turn the tide for human security, for a human-centered peace to impact people's daily lives. Our report has new principles, a call to action, and in doing so, we've identified a way forward. We reaffirm the UN Charter to go back to those basic principles, to build trust through strategic cooperation, not confrontation, and respect for international law must be fundamental to all states. We are suggesting a global architecture for peace, and we ask governments and global institutions to summon once again the political will to work towards this. And the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Accords in 2025 perhaps provides the basis to build a peace architecture anew. The UN Common Agenda report recognizes the need for and to rebuild a new architecture for peace when they said traditional forms of prevention, management, and resolution are ill-suited to face the new risks to peace. We need a new process to begin a downward spiral from war, the arms race, and nuclear Armageddon. Finally, we have a common vision, Olof Palme then and Common Security 22 today. He wrote, "Our vision is of an international order where there is no need for nuclear weapons, where peace and security could be maintained at much lower levels of conventional armaments, and where our common resources could be devoted to providing greater freedom and a better life for people." Friends, it remains unfinished business. For our shared future, let's make common security happen. To give peace a chance, we know what we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you everyone who's been with us here today, and of course everyone who's also following us online. The second part of the journey and the actual work starts now, and it needs all of us to make it. So thank you so much for coming. Please have a report on your way out. It's also available, of course, online and will be distributed. And keep an eye out for more activities on common security ahead. Thank you.